All right, so Module 5, Civil Rights. We know that in terms of what it means to be a constitutional democracy means in part the preservation of fundamental rights and liberties held by we the people, and not just civil liberties that we just got done covering, but also civil rights. And I think we've talked about that a little bit when we talked about civil liberties. Civil rights often involves asking the government to intervene to protect we the people from various forms of discrimination, either from the government itself, national, state, or local, or from our fellow citizens. Something else I would note here, if you're going to talk about the evolution of civil rights in America, you would probably date it at least as far back as 1619, when the first slaves were brought over to the American colonies by the British slave traders. And that's right, we're born in original sin from that point forward, right up to today. And I would say that, speaking very broadly here, the practice of civil rights in America at the outset is not good. It is not good. I would say from 1619 right to the end of the Civil War, right? So about 1864. And really, in terms of making meaningful progress on civil rights, it's really a post-Civil War phenomenon. All right, pre-Civil War, not good, not good at all. Post-Civil War, we start to make progress, although we also sometimes have gone backwards. And notable there, right, would be those Civil War amendments. The 13th, abolishing slavery. The 14th, establishing equal protection of the law and birthright citizenship. And the 15th Amendment, guarantees of suffrage on the basis of race, access to the right to vote. So the next idea here would be some of the basic concepts related to civil rights, the underlying concepts. One we should note here, and as you know, I'm quite attentive to history as a factor in politics today. We can never escape our history. We're always influenced by it, whether we want to be or not. It's just a massive fact. We do have a history here in America, and look, I'm sure every country has its own version of this story. This is the American version. We have a history, right, of using things like race, ethnicity, religion, and gender to reinforce and reproduce all sorts of inequality. That's our sort of deep history, is of using race, ethnicity, religion, and gender instrumentally by those on top to secure their place on top and to reinforce a hierarchy that they seek to reproduce. So that's right. In some ways, that's what we've been trying to overcome, haltingly at times and going backwards at times, since the end of the Civil War. Race. Race is a concept based on physically observable differences between groups of humans. It's far less a biological concept and far more of a social construct, right? Sort of the genetic or chromosomal differences between different races is essentially negligible or nothing. But right, you can see physically observable differences in many cases among groups of people, and that becomes right a social construct. We attach meaning to those physically observable differences, and then we translate it into various forms of hierarchy historically. A tool, if you will, a tool related to power. Ethnicity. Now look, our authors talk about this a bit. They do a nice job, read them. A lot of people do use race and ethnicity interchangeably. I think that's the modern trend. It's certainly what I tend to do. But you can draw a distinction here between race and ethnicity. So if race is based on physically observable differences between groups of people, ethnicity is based on differences among groups of people based on national origin and or culture. Right, so there you might think quintessentially of this, the ethnic identity of Latino, right, based upon national origin, perhaps Mexico, perhaps South America, perhaps Central America, perhaps, I guess, Spain, technically. And it might also be based right on things like culture, maybe language, a tradition of a certain kind of language, or certain traditions that a group observes. I tend to group race and ethnicity together. Others like to draw a clear distinction. And there's a case for either, you know. I just tend to be, I tend to find it more analytically useful to combine those two. Religion, right, has often been used to reinforce and reproduce hierarchy. And here we're thinking about sort of quintessentially minority religious traditions and communities, like the Mormon faith tradition, the Catholic faith tradition historically, like the Irish Catholics that came over, the Jewish community, ongoing issues with that today, of course. There's another version of inequality premised on religious identity, and then gender identity, right, as important, an important source of inequality historically, and something that we are trying to address yet today. That could be the more traditional distinction, right, between men and women. If you think about that, right, who did the founding fathers ultimately, although they left it a little bit open, right, with the Constitution, a little bit silent on that issue, but they were well aware that states would choose universally at that time to disenfranchise women and to enfranchise at least property white men. Need I go into the deep history of inequalities based on male versus female, but also, of course, right, in more recent decades, issues of gender related to the LGBTQ community, ongoing intense debates over that today, of course. Whether that's gay, lesbian, bisexual, asexual, transgender, queer identified, and so forth, right? Questions about, how is that related to power and efforts to create and recreate a certain hierarchy. All right, so what are the forms of inequality that we are dealing with when we're addressing the issue of civil rights in America? A couple ideas here drawn from our text. So again, go to the source, please read the text. They do a nice job of explaining this very carefully. This is my take on that. That would be inequality is typically about questions of power related to political power, economic power, and cultural and social power. Right, the stakes are high. The stakes are high. If your group has a lot of political, economic, and cultural power, that puts you on top, right? And if your group has less political, economic, and cultural power, that puts you in a vulnerable subordinate position. So civil rights, right, is all about the struggle over power. That's why it can be difficult, by the way, to make progress on civil rights. Those on top don't usually want to surrender that top dog position. King always observed that. What he learned, Dr. King, over time, leading the black civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, was that the group on top will never voluntarily surrender that position. He had hoped that he could convince people using a hearts and minds approach to pursue the biblical notion of beloved community, but he ultimately came to believe that that was not practical. Power would have to be wrested away from those on top. And then inequality of opportunity, right? That would be a pretty mainstream concept throughout American history and today, right? Well, early in American history may be controversial. In modern American history, right, not that controversial. That all groups, all individuals should have an equal opportunity to succeed and achieve their version of the American dream. Today, I would say relatively uncontroversial. And this is often a concept based on de jure issues, questions of law. Right, so we know that historically, we had slavery encoded into law, right? A denial of opportunity based on race, written into law. And so how do you deal with that? If you're able to deal with it, if you have the political will, right? You change the laws, right? You abolish slavery, 13th Amendment. Inequality of opportunity de jure in the Jim Crow South after the collapse of Reconstruction in 1877, right? You can actually see, right, school boards having designated public schools for white students and black students, right? That's inequality of opportunity as defined in law. How do you attack that? You attack the laws, right? You change the laws. So we've gotten a lot of that done, haven't we, in the modern era, post-World War II, especially, but also post-Civil War. So you're not going to find too many people today who argue against equality of opportunity based on things like race, gender, religion, and so forth. But, right, the third concept there, inequality of result, right? Should we pursue some version of equality of result between groups? That's de facto issues. That's often very controversial, and I certainly understand why, right? So that would be the idea that today you do see tremendous gaps in many cases based on race. The average wealth, I believe, of the typical white person in America is many times over the typical wealth of a black person in America today. Right? So de facto, not because of legal constraints perhaps, but sort of everyday constraints imposed by history or the behavior of private individuals, perhaps private businesses and so forth, institutional forms of racial inequality that get repeated ad infinitum. Right? We end up with pretty big differences today on economic issues, for example, between black and white America. Incomes are different, wealth is different, educational achievement levels are different. Not mandated by law, right, but a fact of life, de facto. Should we be concerned about that? Right, some say no. Once you have equality of opportunity in the law, you're good to go. Others say no, that's not enough. Right, that inequalities in law do need to be fixed. They largely have been, but that doesn't erase our history. It doesn't erase de facto forms of racial discrimination that we're just not getting at, even with anti-discrimination laws. That there's no really compelling reason why there should be ongoing economic and educational inequality between black Americans and white Americans, and we should work towards that goal of equality of result between different racial groupings. That's very controversial, right? And that underlies, in many cases, right, the concept of affirmative action. And then finally, segregation. Right? That's a form of inequality, often based on race and ethnicity. And again, right, it's a question of de jure versus de facto. De jure racial segregation in public schools, right, is what we addressed with Brown v. Board of Education back in 1954. Right, so today you're not going to find any school district in America that is racially segregated by law. That's been dealt with. Right, but do we still have a lot of racial segregation between different schools in America? We sure do. Because often public schools are neighborhood based. Neighborhoods are often either heavily white or, let's say, heavily black. And so if you have a heavily white neighborhood, right, you're going to have a heavily white public school. And if you have a heavily black neighborhood, you're going to have a heavily black public school. That's de facto racial segregation. And again, right, should we be concerned about that? Some think that we should, and therefore we need things like maybe busing or affirmative action. Others say, oh, heck no. That's not something we should be dealing with politically. We only should be dealing with de jure racial segregation in public schools, not de facto. Difficult stuff.